Cloud. Welcome, everybody.
Hello to everybody. History matters. I'm like so ritualistic, and so does coffee. Um, Welcome. Today, as advertised, what I want to talk about is rules, following rules or not following rules, and how that matters or doesn't matter, how that affects the balance of power. And so I'll be talking a little bit about the past, a little bit about the present. But before I talk about anything, I need to turn to my partner in crime, Matt, who will tell us about the rules of the game.
Good morning, everybody. And appropriately, the rules of the game today. The rules are as follows. And we ask that all parties follow these rules, not just the ones that happen to like it. Well, I'm sure we'll get into that today. These rules are the ones that we always follow, which are we invite you to use chat to have a conversation about really anything related to the conversation. We do ask that you do keep it somewhat germane to the conversation, and that is always family friendly. If you do have questions, make sure you put them in the Q&A. That will allow us to be able to ask the questions without losing them in chat, and make sure that we get to as many questions as possible. So please put your questions in Q&A. And as always, if you do like what we do here at National Council for History Education, please make sure that you join us. We are available on the web and social media. We just finished our conference, and we had it was a great turnout. Thank you, those of you who came. Hopefully, you got a lot out of it. You can spend some time with us on our website for the time being. We do have some great stuff coming up, and I do just want to also say one just personal shout out. I want to thank or welcome, I should say, La Akita Yoshida, who is our new program assistant, who will be helping us out with all kinds of different things. He's a doc student in Washington, and comes from the nonprofit world, and we're really grateful to have his support as our new program assistant. So shout out to him. Hopefully you'll all get to see him throughout the next few months. So
cool.
So thanks, everybody. Well, Joanne, give it back to you.
Okie dokie. I'm gonna. Newbie immediately starts peeping. Okay, I'm just gonna move chat out of the way. Good job, Newbie. Okay. So as I said, I want to talk about rules, following them, not following them, the implications of that. I do want to focus for today, for this conversation, more on people in power, following rules or not following rules. There are many other people we could talk about with power. But for today, I want to talk about people with political power, following rules or not following rules about political power, because we're in the middle of all kinds of moments when people are bringing this up and talking about this, and it's not fair, and you can't do that. You did that, so we should be able to do that. Anyway, that's what prompted my wanting to talk about this subject. Now, I think it's really easy to assume that talking about rules is a kind of a cut and dried matter, that you follow them or you don't, right? So it's one or another. There's not a lot of middle ground. You're following the rules, you're obeying procedure, or you're not. And that is not the case. And that is what I want to talk about this morning is, and particularly, obviously, I'm immersed in congressional history, so I'll be using that as an example. But rules are more malleable than one might assume. I think they've been proven more malleable for better and worse in recent years. And that matters for a lot of reasons. So my sort of starting point here is I actually think following rules and what happens when you do or don't follow them, I'm kind of thinking about that as being more like a spectrum. And on one end of the spectrum is we obey all the rules all the time. We follow everything. We don't violate anything. And that never happens. That's on one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum is, to heck with all the rules. I don't really care. And you can name it what you want to name it. Chaos, tyranny. We're not there either. Somewhere in the middle are a lot of other different points. And so it's the middle that I want to talk about today. So I want to talk about a couple of different, I guess, I don't know if it didn't count how many, 3, 4, 5 different modes of dealing with rules, sort of working our way across the spectrum. One of the really obvious ways that people can follow all of the rules, but sort of twist the process a little, and this one is not surprising, and this is also something that's not new or rare, and that is favoritism, right? So particularly like in the House, the speaker can call on people from his or her own party more than the other party. That doesn't necessarily happen all the time, but it sure happened a lot. And certainly when I was writing my book, there were a lot of people who complained. I didn't have time to get the quote, but there's one quote in there somewhere where one congressman insults the president, I think, and another one insults someone else, and the one gets called on it and the other doesn't. And the one who gets called on it was like, hey, he called so-and-so a jackass yesterday. How come I don't get to say this today? So there is favoritism. There always has been favoritism. People called on more quickly, people or first, more often, rules being more strictly or harshly enforced. So that's hardly surprising. That's like a partisan thing that has gone on for a really long time. There's also something that, formally speaking, on the spectrum of rule obeying, follows the rules. It's just a little closer, a little further away from the we follow rules all the time angle. And that is changing the rules to serve your side. And that's also not new. Every house makes its own rules. The Senate is a continuing body, so the rules work slightly differently there. But all of the talk about the filibuster is part of this. About we need to reform or change rules because it's a great thing for democracy, and of course also because we find it helpful or not. The filibuster. What's interesting about that, and we've talked about it before, and if you go to our website, ncheteach.org/conversations, there will be an episode on the filibuster. We talked about that, but one of the interesting things is people claiming democracy is bound up with the filibuster. It goes back to the dawning of the republic. How dare you strike it down? It's like, no, really. It doesn't go back to the dawning of the republic. It's not. It's actually most recently been used here. I actually have facts and figures for you. In the last, between 2009 and 2010. Here is the fact for the morning, or one of them. There were more filibusters between 2009 and 2010. I hadn't even focused that was 1 year, than there were in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s combined. So filibuster as a tactic, as a strategy, that's not. Back to the dawn of the republic, George Washington saying, protect the filibuster. No. But that's an example of playing with rules to benefit yourself and hurt someone else. Obviously, that's a partisan thing. The filibuster has often been obviously deployed for partisan purposes. Another example, historical example, you could use along these lines is the gag rule, which we have also talked about on History Matters. I have to say, occasionally now I'm having a hard time coming up with a topic because I can't remember what we've discussed already, and I'll go back and rummage through, and then I'll see something close, so anyway, that's what happens when you go on for more than a year. But anyway, the gag rule. So this idea that a rule will be passed that in one way or another will silence discussion of anti-slavery petitions. And obviously, in that case, it's not necessarily just party that's being affected. There's also a northern-southern component to that. But still, that's changing a rule to benefit one part of an argument. So that's the same idea. Still, that's abiding by the rules, changing them, but you're still sort of entrenched in the system. The question is, what will the system do around you? Now we move on to something a little different on that spectrum. So favoritism, changing the rules. Next we have questionably okay. Maybe it's allowable, or it's allowable, but it's so close to not being that it goes beyond what feels right. The immediate thing I always think of when I think of this, just because it's so obvious, and I know I must have talked about this. This is what I do to my students all the time too. Did I tell you this story? So forgive me, because I probably have told you a lot of these stories. This is a Hamilton letter during the election of 1800. I must have talked about it when we talked about the election of 1800. Hamilton's panicked. To him, it's a crisis. It's like Burr or Jefferson for president. How am I living in this life where that is possible? And given a choice, it had better be Jefferson and not Burr. But before he even gets to that point, when he's just worried about Federalist versus Republican, he writes a letter, clearly a sort of bang of a letter, like, to Governor John Jay, and says, essentially, we need to change the rules of how we do elections in New York so that we can knock down the Republicans. So, right, he right out and out is like, because the legislature is going to pick electors, and the legislature, the new legislature is going to go Republican, so we need to change. Anyway, I'm not going to go into the details, but at any rate, he basically says, let's change the electoral rules during the election so that Federalists will win in New York. He then very carefully goes on, right? Because you read that and you're like, even back in 1800, you read that and you're like, really? Like that? And he says, oh, let me tell you, like, this is legal and constitutional. And tries to explain how it's legal and constitutional. The fact that he feels the need to do that shows you that he acknowledges the fact that on that spectrum, it's moving towards the bad side of the spectrum. He sends this to John Jay, and I've talked before about how in a crisis, in one article that I've written, I call it a crisis mentality, that when have that kind of crisis mentality, when you really feel that you're in a crisis, people often tend to have no holds barred. Anything is possible, everything is necessary. It doesn't matter, break all the rules. We have to do what's necessary. And you can see that happening in politics, happened a lot in 1800. And that's essentially what Hamilton is doing here. Okay, so favoritism, changing the rules, sliding a little bit on what's allowable or not. We then get to a clear one that I don't even necessarily have to show you an example of, and it's not new. Lying. Lying and misleading, right? So just out and out finding ways to do something and either hiding it or covering it up or pretending like it's something else, or, and obviously that's hardly new to politics. But that is on that spectrum. We've moved a little past Hamilton at this point, and now we're just like sort of putting up a facade in some way. There's always facades in politics, but this is moving a little bit more towards, no, that's just wrong. Okay, now we come to a really important one that still isn't bluntly violating rules, but it's clearly wrong. And this is a category, we've talked about this before too, and this is why this is such an important category, and that is norms. And I always think of Cheers whenever I say that, and I'm sure many of you do too. But this, and I've never thought about norms as much as in the last, 6 years. I knew they were there. I could have named some for you. But the problem with norms is that they're not codified, really. They're just like everyone understands this is how it's supposed to work. Why? Well, because if it works that way, things seem fair. The institutions are being upheld in a good way. We're protecting. I found one thing when I was looking this morning, someone used the phrase institutional patriotism. Right? So institutional patriotism partly upholds norms. It's like, I want to protect the institution. There used to be a very strong sense of that, particularly in the Senate, right? Where the elevated body, even more elevated than the House, and institutional patriotism should keep us trying to follow a good line, stay in order, not violate the rules and degrade into something bad. And there were usually people in the Senate who took that role, right? And would stand up. Even in my book, there are people who stand up and say, gentlemen, but the Senate, or whatever, like protect the. So that sometimes holds people back. But the fact of the matter is, norms are floating things that are there because people agree that they're norms or have not questioned them before. It's the way they've always been done. They've always been done that way, either because it seemed fair and acceptable or because it seemed unfair, but no one challenged it. And what we have been seeing, and are still seeing in many different ways, are just people violating norms left and right. And every time it happens, we're sort of confronted with this situation where first you want to say, they can't do that. And then you realize, yeah, actually they can do, they can do that. it's in bad faith. It's not how you conduct yourself in a democratic politics of debate and compromise, which is grounded on negotiating. But you can violate rules, and depending on the reaction, sometimes nothing happens, or even worse, you get a new, worse norm, right? So norms are kind of a key category. I'm not going to go into details, but preventing a president from selecting a Supreme Court justice, for example, that's not a norm. Can't say that nothing near it ever happened before, but bluntly just saying, nope, not going to let it happen. That's an interesting norm violation. Deciding just to close down the government, I'm not going to get what we want, we're going to close down the government. Again, as a historian, I rarely say, like, nothing like this has ever happened, it's unprecedented. However, the sort of blunt easiness with which these norms are sort of being tossed off, and often on one side, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute, it's important because norms are being violated, and we have discovered there's little you can do about it, and yet they're vitally important to the functioning of our system of government, to the spirit of our system of government, to the impact of our system of government, to its legacy. In all kinds of ways, these norms are vitally important. Maybe in time, some of them might be actually made more formal, I don't know. But for now, they're not, and we're living with the consequences of that. And every time a norm is violated, and it's a noteworthy one that even we who are not sort of in the midst of political institutions would recognize, it's sort of like, wait, that, now what? Contingency. You guys are playing, some of you have bingo cards. And I know contingency is on some of them. But yeah, norms are violated. Certainly there have been so many times in recent years that I've thought, along the lines of what I said before, they can't do that. And then you think and you realize, no, actually they can. What does that mean? They shouldn't, but they can. I don't know what that means. So, we're living at a time when that's happening a lot, with sort of a sense of abandon. And that's important, and that can have big implications. So in the rule busting spectrum that I'm talking about here, that's moving towards the bad side of that spectrum. Now we get to just the bad side of the spectrum, and that is just breaking rules. just like whatever. I don't care. I'm just going to break the rules. My 19th century congressman, my book is, in a sense, a book about Southern congressmen breaking rules and getting away with it and having an impact for a variety of reasons. And doing it, I'm going to come back to this in a moment, doing it because they felt entitled to power, doing it because they felt it was a matter of life and death. They're protecting slavery and the power of the South to dominate the government. But that's what they're doing. They're waving weapons at each other. They're slugging each other. They're making threats. They're making threats in committee rooms, threatening people if they testify the wrong way. They're doing all kinds of things that, like, this isn't just norms. Like this, they're violating rules. You can twist rules in all kinds of ways to be abrasive or to create log jams of one kind or another. But just breaking the rules, that is a problem, and it's particularly a problem when nobody calls people on it, when everyone knows that's not right, and then nothing really happens. I think, and I am not wading into the middle of a gun debate, but if you are refusing to go through a metal detector, and that's been put in place now, and that's the procedure, and that's what you're supposed to do, and then you insist on going onto the floor with a gun, is that bluntly violating a rule? It's doing more than violating a norm. It's moving on in that direction. There are things, that just break the rules, but the problem is they need to be enforced. The rules have to be enforced, and throughout history, particularly in Congress, nothing is ever enforced consistently. Sometimes better than others, but still, enforcement is part of the key. So it's not just the rule existing, it's them actually being enforced. So here comes the question then. How do you get to a point where you just blithely, like, oh, okay, I don't care about the rules? As I mentioned before, there's sort of a crisis mentality. And that's one way. And that's, in a sense, I don't want to say a good faith way, but it has more good faith to it than the other way I'm going to mention here. If you truly believe things are going down in flames, you might not be doing the right thing. You might be doing something you really should not do, but that person at least is sort of acting out of a sincere belief of something. I might not like that belief, but there's at least some thread of decency mixed amidst the bad impulse. Another way you get to the point of just abandoning rules is if you have a sense of entitlement and you will do whatever it takes to keep power. That's a dangerous way to deal with rules, that you will do anything, that ends justify means. We're in a moment, and not just right now, but a chunk of years we're talking about here, when that's been part of the way that the political game is being played. And that's a problem. First of all, it's not just violating norms, it's sometimes breaking rules. We don't see a lot of oversight. We don't see a lot of punishment for people who are doing all the breaking and sweeping aside of norms and rules. And that's part of the problem, is oversight. There needs to be oversight for any of this to have any kind of an impact. If you're asked, if Congress wants you to come and testify and you just refuse, if you're given a summons and you refuse and nothing happens, why would anyone else feel compelled to go? Right? Things need to be enforced to actually have some power. Now the letter that I posted up as a document for today, we have used this before, way towards the beginning of when we began doing History Matters. And I included it because at the time I used it because it's such a remarkable testament to feelings, the importance of feelings in shaping political decisions. And it's a letter, it's 3 Republican members of Congress, and the Republican Party is new in the second half of the 1850s. These 3 Republicans who decide that they can no longer sit by as these Southerners insult them and threaten them and silence them. And they write in this letter, in addition to the fact that they're pouring their feelings into this letter, they also say, we were sitting there, they're describing what it felt like, and the constitutional rights of our constituents to be represented was being violated. Our sense of manhood was being violated. We were not being allowed to do the job that we're put here for. Representation was not happening in the proper way that it should happen. So particularly for that reason, we need to start breaking rules. And these particular congressmen decide, in their case, they're breaking a lot of rules. So they're going to do something that shouldn't be happening in Congress and actually is against the law. And that is, they now will challenge people to duels, particularly Southerners to duels if they go too far, which is an extreme decision for a Northerner to make. And what I love about that document, one of the many things I love about that document, is they explain how they come to make that kind of an extreme decision, which is part of what I'm getting at this morning. It's this sense, for better and worse, that something catastrophic is going to happen. But in their case, the whole system of representation is actually being violated. Their constituents, their representatives can't stand up and speak on their behalf. There's a justification in that to fix the system, right? There's a validity to that kind of assumption. And so in those last few years before the Civil War, you get a lot of violence in Congress. And part of it is because they're talking about slavery in a more and more intense way, and Kansas-Nebraska Act. But part of it is because these Republicans come to Congress and they state outright, we're a different kind of Northerner. We're going to fight. We're going to fight back. And again and again and again, you see in the congressional record, or the equivalent of the congressional record, Northerners stand up and say, we are a different kind of Northerner. We've been put here to stand up and not bow down. And some of them come with weapons. So they come into Congress prepared to break rules, hoping they don't have to, but trying to change the balance of power. And that's kind of the last point, I suppose, or one of the last points, there's a quote I'm going to want to read you, but so when you have, I'm going to put this over here so I stop looking at it. When you have one side that is just abandoning rules, very often what happens is the other side begins to feel compelled to hang on to them, partly in self-defense and partly for the purposes of defending the institution, right? So very often, and particularly throughout the entire, 1830 to 1860 in my book, that's what happens is you have Southerners routinely violating all kinds of rules, rarely getting called on it, sometimes, but rarely. And the other side, Northerners, or depending if it's party, then it's, it would be Southern Democrats and Southern Whigs. So it's Southerners, whatever party they're in, violating rules, and Northerners always standing up and saying, but the rules. Actually, John Quincy Adams had a nickname for the kinds of speeches that happened after a Southerner broke the rules. There was always a Northerner who would stand up and say, but the institution, but the rules. And John Quincy Adams called them lamentation speeches. Like, you're going to have them. Someone's going to stand up and do that, and nothing's going to change, and it's just going to keep happening. So you end up with an imbalance of power, which is precisely what the Southerners wanted. Now, the next logical question is, what do you do in that case? And I do not have the answer to that, because we certainly don't want to do what happened before, right? Which is both sides begin to fight and break the rules, and the institution dissolves. So we don't want to do that. But what we are looking at, when you're looking at one side breaking rules and the other side feeling responsible to uphold them, is an imbalance of power. That's kind of the moment that we're in. And I just think that's something we need to think about. I particularly think people who know more than I do about the internal working of the modern Congress need to think about that. I'm going to stop in a moment, but however many weeks ago or months ago, I was speaking to some members of Congress about this kind of an issue. And one of the things they were like, what can we do to make things better? And I said, well, one thing is to actually enforce rules, like if people break the rules, enforce them evenly, everybody, whoever breaks them, not in a partisan way, not in a revengeful way, not in a spirit of attack, but just enforce the rules. There are other more positive ways of fixing things. And again, I'm not an expert, so I was tossing off ideas based on my historical knowledge. I cannot predict whatever needs to happen in the modern Congress, but still, the point to think about here is the link between rules and power, and that if you can break rules with impunity, you have a lot of power. Accountability is the thing that can get into that equation and change it. And we're at a moment where there's very little accountability for anything, where people are refusing accountability on all counts. And that's where we are, is people on breaking rules and claiming power by breaking those rules, and no accountability to pull the reins on this and change it. That's where we are. And that's why on Twitter, I'm very frequently saying accountability. And I'll sometimes say, well, it's the core of a democratic process of government. It is. Public servants, which in and of itself is a handy phrase that ought to be said a lot more. Public servants, all capital letters, are accountable to us. We put them there and we can take them out, and they're supposed to be doing what we want. Now, we all want different things. It's not easy, but part of the way our system of government runs, or any democracy runs, is accountability. So by my saying we're in a crisis of accountability, people do things, people say things. Cancel culture is part of the same phenomenon, right? Not all of it. I mean, I'm not going to run into that morass either, but people who say something obnoxious or do something really obnoxious that violates rules, or it does something that's clearly wrong, and then they get called on it and they yell cancel culture. No, that's called accountability. If you do something wrong, clearly wrong, or you say something so offensive and someone says, you said something offensive, that's not cancel culture. That's accountability. And the fact that we can't actually say that with clarity because people are blurring that line, that's a problem too. Okay, I'm going to stop talking. I was particularly chatty today, but I'm going to open chat. And I moved it so I really couldn't see what you guys were saying. but the mug, Carolee does not even have to say. She did though. Okay, she's like, mug, just one word. Okay, and someone said there was a wardrobe malfunction. There was. I held up the mug before, and then the napkin I'm using to hide it slipped, and I was like, dang. No, because I thought this morning, what in the world, what mug can I use that talks about rules? It's the Pomp and Crest mug. So for those of you who are not here at this time, we did an episode on women and political power, and it was an essay, in a newspaper essay that was making fun of the fact that women. There was a woman who, according to this fictional account, wanted to be the doorman, the door person of the house, and was like, I can have power. Why can't I? Like, I have wigs that are very tall, so I'll be just as tall as everyone else. So it was just totally making fun of women and the idea of women having power. And you will remember her full name, Roxanne something Pomp and Crest.
Wilhelmina.
Okay.
Roxana
Wilhelmina
Wilhelmina
Pomp and Crest was the name of this
yes.
fictional character. Who made the original Pomp and Crest?
What's that?
If you're out there, come in. But this was made by not us, but by a wonderful person who is part of this community of ours. At any rate, I finally, it was like, it sits up there on my shelf, and I'm like, when can I get Pomp and Crest? Today. Today was the Pomp and Crest day. So anyway, and it was totally on target. Okay. So I will.
Question. She has not tweeted in a very long time because.
Yeah. Pomp and Crest is on Twitter.
She is on Twitter at Pomp and Crest. She's not tweeted in a very long time because we all know how terrible I am with Twitter, and I've been using my actual name, Matthew T. Messiah's account, much more frequently. So I will have to spend some more time on the Pomp and Crest.
Okay. So now you have your background.
Oh, the background. Yes. So went a long way for this one. And I'm going to be honest, I'm not 100% convinced that I buy that this is what it is. But according to the internet, which is always true, as we know, this is the home of one Henry Martin Robert, who you may be familiar with. Henry Martin Robert, anybody? Author of Robert's Rules of Order.
Oh, as soon as you said Roberts, I was like, boom, okay.
So supposedly this is the house that he wrote Robert's Rules of Order in. So that's where
I'm gonna accept that it is, because it's such a good try. It's such a good, but that if it had been, it would, if we knew that for sure, it'd be amazing. But even without it, you thought of that?
I found two sources with the house. The house is supposedly in New York. Starts with an O. Hang on. It is Owego. Owego, New York is. And there is apparently a placard here that says this is the former residence of General Henry Martin Robert, parliamentarian.
That's perfect. That's like, that ranks up there in like your top 10 backgrounds, I think.
Owego, yes.
Owego.
Not Oswego, but it just says Owego, Owego. Yeah.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay. Okay, so I'm gonna shut up now and allow you guys to ask questions.
Our questions up here. Before we do the questions, I just say out loud, Tim, thank you for sharing all that in chat as Joanne was talking. We're, of course, terribly sorry for your loss, and if we can ever do anything, please don't hesitate to reach out. Those are wonderful memories that you shared. Catherine, if there is 18th, 19th century correspondence about, quote unquote, let's fix things so our party wins, would you say that democracy has always been at risk in the US, perhaps at more times than others?
Well, certainly sometimes more than other times. Democracy is full of vulnerabilities, which is why some of the founders like Hamilton were very worried about it, because it's grounded on public opinion that can be swayed by all kinds of people like demagogues, the wrong people get office, or whatever. There's all kinds of reasons why democracy can go wrong. So in and of itself, that's a problem. I think partisanship, you add that into the equation, and that's a big problem, right? And that's, if you go all the way back to Washington and his gang to the 1790s, they did not want national political parties because of the sorts of things we're talking about here, right? They thought that a political party is a group that's only attached to its good and not the greater good. And so they didn't account for national parties. Also, they couldn't imagine that they could possibly happen because the nation was so diverse and it had a hard enough time coming together under anything, the Articles of Confederation. Who the heck was going to see it, coming together as a party? But part of the reason why parties were scary was partisanship. And partisanship, just there to promote yourself and your friends into getting power. So it's always been a problem, rule breaking. I do think, and I'm not gonna, as I said, as a historian, I'm not gonna say it's worse than it's ever been. First of all, because that's probably not true, and secondly, because you never say that as a historian. You always say, like, among the worst times, or like surprisingly bad. Whatever all the ways are that you sort of wing that as a historian. But we're in a chunk of time, maybe from the 90s, that rules are being violated and norms with regularity, more by one side than the other. And there's not a lot of accountability. And now we're at the point where it affects the balance of power between branches of government, right? So I think that was the quote. Let me see if I can find it here. So the quote I had that I didn't end up reading was just about this point that Congress isn't doing oversight of much, including itself. And if that's the case, then other branches of government can just, sneer at Congress. It has no power. So the short version of that is rules are broken all the time and have always been. I always say this when I talk about the founding period, there has never been a golden moment of political perfection in American history. It just doesn't exist. So anyone who looks back to the founding as some kind of ideal moment, my whole career is based on the fact that is wrong, right? My whole first book is like dirty, nasty politics. So it's never been perfect, but there are times that are worse than others. And we're in a particularly bad moment of time when, and it's not the first time that the United States has been so divided that, as I've said before, there's very little we right now, and that's kind of what holds us together. We're at an extreme moment. And when you connect that, with some of the extreme rule violating and norm violating we've seen, and with a pandemic that's killing people, and with democracy being threatened all over the world, that's a lot of things. So some of what's happening now, I think, is unprecedented because of all of those things bundling together. I think the mix of things, I think that's always true in history. The mix of things at a given moment causes things to happen a certain way. And so I can look back in American history and point to moments that are polarized, violent, nasty, but no two of them are ever going to be the same for many, many reasons. But one of them will be the blend of things creating them are never exactly the same. Never mind the historical context and the culture of the time and whatever else. Okay, I'm in a chatty mood this morning. I'm going to stop and allow another question.
Great. No, it's very helpful. I'm going to ask, I was actually going to go with a different question first, but I have to go with this one because this is emblematic of why I love this community. Not the question, but who's asking it. This is from Jeannie, as in I dream of Jeannie, is how she put it. So thank you, Jeannie, we've been saying your name wrong for like months and months.
Oh no!
So apparently, because we always say Jean, but it's actually Jeannie, according to this. So Jeannie, as in I dream of Jeannie. She asks, what is the role of the sergeant-at-arms in each chamber? Do they act on their own or carry out the will of the speaker or the leadership? And I think this is an important question because you talked about enforcing the rules, and I think it'd be helpful to understand, like, okay, how? Like, who enforces those rules and how do they do that? Do they use the sergeant-at-arms? Do they use the Capitol Police? How do they do that? Yeah.
Excellent.
Other than censure and,
arcane.
Yeah.
Well, the sergeant-at-arms, and again, I'm always talking with far more knowledge about the 19th century than the 20th or 21st. but certainly, having looked at the 19th century Congress in great detail for many decades, the sergeant at arms was seen as someone who was enforced rules and rushed to protect people if things were erupting. So there's an incident when it's like in the early 1850s, I think, and a northerner accuses a southerner of being a disunionist or something like that, and the southerner jumps to his feet and begins howling, and other southerner. It ends up being like a huge what someone at the time calls an explosion. I think the quote is, "It was as if a bomb had gone off in the house." This was just everyone jumps to their feet because howling and running at each other, and the sergeant at arms, who is telling this story, like runs over to the guy who's being attacked for saying you're a disunionist without his mace, right? We haven't even gotten to the mace yet. The sergeant at arms runs over to protect him because that's one of his things. He's supposed to help somehow enforce and protect. And he gets there and he realizes, yeah, just me isn't going to do anything. So he runs and gets the mace and runs back. And the mace, the sergeant at arms is supposed to be able to bear the mace as a symbol of the authority of the house, and a symbol of respect for the institution. And supposedly, when it's raised that way, it's supposed to inspire people to back down, because it's like a reminder saying, gentlemen, this is the body we're talking about, and you are not living up to what it is. And this symbol, think of what this represents. In this particular instance, people basically are like, get out of here with the mace. Like, we don't care about the mace. We're in the moment. So the sergeant at arms, certainly in my 19th century Congress, does a lot of stuff. He goes into the galleries, the visitors galleries, sometimes to shut people up or pull people out. He's down on the floor. So yeah, they are one way that rules get enforced. But I can't compare different sergeants at arms as to how much that varies between Congresses. I don't know, but that is one way that rules get enforced.
So I want to build on that question with Tom's question here, which is Tom P, because we do have a couple Toms here. How does social or peer pressure come into play when it comes to enforcing norms? Does it work when both sides reject the very legitimacy of the other side and are therefore oblivious to their entreaties? Sorry.
So how does peer pressure?
Yeah, so extending that then. So we have the sergeant at arms, but we to help try to enforce things supposedly. But how does sort of the norms of social pressure or peer pressure, how do those, when we're talking about Congress, and really we're talking about I think the 1850s Congress as sort of the example, how does that come into play, and what can we learn from that? Because he asks, does it work? Does peer pressure, social pressure work when both sides reject the legitimacy of the other side? So that's a long way of asking.
Yeah. It can. I mean, so one of the things I read this morning was an article that I think originally appeared in Roll Call, called "The Broken Branch," by Norm Ornstein and Thomas Mann, and they were talking about the fact, some of the things I talked about here, and one of the things that they said was, usually there have been, whatever you want to call them, moderate people or maverick people or individuals who took on themselves the responsibility for standing up, not the majority leader, and not the speaker, and not but just people who had that kind of authority to be able to jump up and sort of quiet people and remind them of the respect they're supposed to have. And one of the points that this article makes is that we really don't have a lot of those people right now, and that's a problem, because individuals can make a big difference. In history, you're not supposed to say, like, this one person made a difference, but sometimes they do. In this case, that kind of person could make a big difference. So I don't know if that answers the question. I've already lost the question, but
the question was about
peer pressure.
Yeah, peer pressure.
Peer pressure. Yeah,
Uh,
and that's a case of peer pressure. That's why I brought it up, is because that's a case of an authoritative or a person with some kind of status or authority, um, basically using that to intervene. And it's also true, you know, if your colleagues, if your side, if your party mates um, are violating a lot of rules or not violating a lot of rules, that's going to affect you. There's a peer pressure matters a lot because peer pressure is bound up with reputation and power. So it's not just a matter of, oh, like the guys want me to do this and I don't want to. It's like, well, if I don't, how is this going to affect my reputation in this body? How is this going to affect my career? How is this going to affect how much power I have? And that kind of calculation goes on all the time, present and past. So peer pressure has more power than it should because it affects reputation, power, and career.
I don't know if you know the answer to this question, but Dale asks this good question. Has the sergeant of arms ever been sent out to enforce a summons other than on House of Cards?
Oh no, I believe. Well, what I can't again speak for the modern Congress. In the 19th century, there are certainly moments when there were not enough people in the House uh, to have a vote, and the sergeant at arms went out and found people in their homes and like dragged them in. So yeah, but again, that's the 19th century. You know, you can move into the 20th century, and my detail knowledge begins to.
It's entirely possible at some point during the 20th century, but we have no.
It totally is.
All right, so I'm going to move into some different kinds of questions here, just because I think they're really, really interesting. Tim asks, what's the difference, if any, between norms, rules, and the social contract?
Ooh, okay.
They're very philosophical type. These are more heady questions, but
okay. Well, the first one I can say, because norms with relative ease, because rules are in some way codified, written down, agreed upon. Norms are unspoken agreements. Like, this is the way it's always been done. This is the way we think it should be done. This is the way until now it has been done. Norms are not necessarily any less clear than rules, but they allow for a lot more wiggle room, which you sometimes don't realize until someone wiggles, right? And then you're like, that's violating a norm. So the difference between those two is that rules are, you know, in some way codified. You violate them and it's very clear. Norms are kind of an agreement, and an agreement that doesn't get talked about a lot until somebody goes against that agreement. And right now we just happen to be at a moment where there are a lot of people doing that. The last one was a compact. What was
the social contract?
Social contract. Well, I do think so. I thought about this a lot when I was writing my last book about like what holds the nation together politically, as well as an institution together politically. And I think I even wrote it down somewhere, and then I didn't talk about it this morning. I think, particularly Congress, but our government, there are rules, there's a constitution, there are all kinds of things that hold it together, but there's a lot of reliance on faith and trust in the system and in each other. That holds things together, which is not to say that everyone has to trust everyone and have absolute faith in everyone, but there's a lot of faith, there should be a lot of faith, generally speaking, that generally people are going to try and abide by the rules. Generally speaking, they're going to be in good faith, generally speaking. And we're in a moment where that's kind of not true, but that's a kind of contract, right? That's a kind of understanding of a contract, that we all are sort of, the Constitution is kind of the fundamental contract we've all agreed to abide by. The spirit of the government is sort of something we've all generally agreed to, even though that is a big, messy term. There's a general level of agreement about things that sometimes isn't there. We're at an isn't there moment. So there should be some kind of a sense of a political and social contract that people agree voluntarily to follow because of their feelings about the government that they're in, their responsibility in acting within it and doing good with it. and their role, just for what they're doing, whatever role they're serving. So it is a contract, I suppose, because it's voluntary. You enter voluntarily, and you can break contracts. So it's different. But that was Tim, I guess. That's I think part of the. I don't know if I call it a spectrum. I always think first of spectrums, but yeah, I think it's on those three things are related. But I think rules, in a sense, stand out because they're clearer, and with a rule, it's very clear you can break them. Then there's all the fuzzy room I talked about today. But
yeah. So this is my weekly hijacking the conversation for 2.5 seconds, which is
okay.
It's just building on that. Putting on my sociologist's hat, when we think about norms are always either socially or culturally situated, right? Like they're norms because the people doing them agreed to them based on social and cultural reasons, right? And so when we apply that to this idea of Congress, then I promise there's a question coming up here, which is when we apply that idea to Congress, that sort of the norms of behavior, norms and expectations about what is permissible and what's not permissible. If we think about Congress as sort of a micro society in some ways, looking back on that and that time when where you have a great deal of knowledge of Congress, not necessarily 20th century, but in the past, do you see that as holding true, that and I wonder if the norm breakers were norm breakers because they weren't part of the social class of sort of the expected social class, right? Sometimes we think of as Congress people as all being lawyers, and so if somebody comes in and they're called a maverick because they don't buy into the rules or whatever. You know what I mean? Like they're just from a different not social class necessarily, but part of society where the norms might be different, and that tends to cause tension or conflict. Does that hold water?
Well, that was a thing that was one of the questions I had when I started my last book, which was Northerners, Southerners, and Westerners, among others, have a different sense of law and order, a different sense of what's allowable and not, a different understanding of manhood, a different, their way of ordering society can be really different. So, and there are books about this that talk in great detail, particularly North and South. The Southerners are much more comfortable with man-to-man combat. Northerners tend to riot. So it's not like one is violent and the other isn't, but there are different kinds of violence and different kinds of line drawing that goes on. And so the thing that I was interested in was, so what happens when you put them all together in a body and they have to do really controversial things together? Like what happens? And what happens is sometimes the exact thing you're asking about, Matt, which is those differences can be played to help, in this case, the Southerners are like, yeah, we're really comfortable with dueling and man-to-man combat. So come at me because I can come right back at you, and you, Mr. Northerner, who are not comfortable with man-to-man combat and your constituents will not like it if you duel, I have more power than you. So yeah, I think all of those things matter a lot. And that comes with, this is an obvious thing to say, but I'll say it anyway, the importance of historical context. When you're looking at things, so for all of my talk about rules and patterns over time, and you also have to think about, where something is happening and what the rules are of behavior and, in the case of politics, often manhood or whatever else, those can be so different over time, and yet they can be so powerful. And we can see that now, right? You can see how feelings are governing things to an extreme degree. We can see how ideas about manhood are like bulk, right in our face. All of these things, you can see how they're shaping not just the political climate, but politics and the nation. And that's, it's easy to overlook that and think political history is just acts and congresses and voting. And that's not true.
Well, we have time for one more question here, and keeping in my sort of heady philosophical way to end this particular episode, Melissa wants to know, what kinds of knowledge do we have that the founders didn't, that can cause our perspective and choices to be different? And I think she's referring to with respect to rules and norms. So what kind of knowledge do we have that the founders didn't? And I'm reading this as a philosophical question, not a
Yeah.
like we have the internet and they don't take the question.
Right. TV. What do we have that they don't? Well, for one thing, if you're talking about politics, when I look at the evolution of politics in this period, what I see is the gradual realization until of the usefulness of parties on a national level. So one thing that the founders don't get or have is an understanding of the power of an organized party, and that it isn't necessarily a bad thing, right?
Mhm.
Later on, like Martin Van Buren writes a tract in which he's like, hey, you know what? Parties can be good. They can unite a nation. And that's like, woohoo, that's way far from where things started. You can see people in that early period struggling to do things that parties do. So like Jefferson wants to distribute a pamphlet to Republicans around the nation, and he doesn't know how to do it, right? And he says, there are these clubs that meet in Virginia, Republican clubs, and what if we found a way to use the clubs to distribute the pamphlets? That's networking, right? That's kind of what part of what parties do. So you can see they're trying to get there, but they're not going to get there. It's just so opposed to everything that they think. So that's one thing. And once you accept that kind of, I'm going to say the I word, infrastructure, once you accept that that kind of organized, eventually professionalized mode of politics works, boy, that changes everything. So if you're looking at the founding period, you know, as a historical period, that's one thing for sure. It's just their fundamental assumption about how national politics works. No organized national parties, no party system, just a very different kind of a climate. And an assumption on their part in those early years that it's going to be much more prestigious and attractive to hold state power rather than national power, right? After Washington, it becomes a little tricky to get real sort of men of worth, prominent people to come and serve in the national government, because where they really have power is actually on a state level, and people don't necessarily want to go to the national level. So their whole understanding is so different from ours. This is all the sorts of stuff that I love to kind of crawl into their brains and try and figure out.
Well, we are at 11:02, which is exactly an hour. So I will say my goodbyes and then turn it over to Joanne, and then we will proceed into the after party. So thank you, everybody, for your conversation today. Your great questions. Those are really helpful, really informative. So thank you for that. And as always, if you do like what we do here at the National Council for History Education, please join us. You can find us online at www.ncheteach.org. You can find us on Twitter at HistoryEd, or on Facebook and Instagram at NC the number 4 HE. If you want to follow Joanne on Twitter, as if you don't already, it's at JBF1755, and I can be personally found at Matthew T. Messias. And then, of course, we did mention our alter ego at Pomp and Crest, which is also on
Pomp and Crest.
So.
Okay, I do want to before we segue, for those of you who are new here or have never stuck around till the end of what we do, what we do every week is after this portion of what we do that's recorded, we stop recording and we segue into the after party, which is less formal, more personal, definitely fun, but not recorded, so we can talk more freely. If you are connected here just through the NCHE website, all you have to do is stick around. If you connected here through Facebook, you're going to have to find the website, the NCHE website, and connect in that way. But you can join us, and we do that for a little while every week, and it's great, trust me. But before we do that, I just want to say, as always, and we had a real example of this, I think, at the conference, where like our communityness was like, and partly because of Matt's, I don't know if it started with Matt, but Matt whoever came up with the idea of putting faces of us seeing you guys, that was a weird idea. But I want to make the point, as I always do, that part of what drives me to do this is that I think talking about these kinds of issues publicly with each other is hugely important. And I still think democracy is imperiled here and around the world. And I think this might seem small, but it isn't. Some of you are teachers, it matters. And so far beyond us, the fact that this happens matters. And I want to join you guys. Thank you guys for joining us. Man, I need more coffee. I want to thank you for joining us. And I will see you guys next week. And at some point I'll figure out what we're going to talk about. So with that, I will say goodbye, and everybody have a good week and stay safe.